How do you how does colorblind racism explain the huge disparities in educational, economic, health, and other outcomes between Blacks and whites?
This is a loaded question.
Yeah,
So I'm going to tackle it in two ways with the disclaimer that this is only the surface answer.
right.
But let's revisit what colorblind racism is. Essentially, it's denial that there are racial disparities, that there is no such thing as racism anymore, that tying racism to the transatlantic slave trade and that's done. So we no longer we live in a post-racial society. So that's a very brief explanation of what colorblind racism is. And how we see that play out is within the policies and cultural practices of today. So I'm just going to use one example of how colorblind racism leads to perpetuation of racism and oppression that leads to the disparities. And I talk about it a lot in my workshops because it's incredibly relevant. And this is just one example of many. And that is critical race theory. Across the country right now, law bills are being presented and laws are being passed. Some have already passed, some are still on the docket to ban the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. And I'm not going to read the entire bill, but in a nutshell, it pretty much says that white students shouldn't feel guilty for being white, and that teaching of critical race theory further divides our children, and we are all created equal. And why should we talk about something that makes our white children feel bad for being white? The whole premise of that bill is colorblind racism. It is implying that we no longer have a race issue, and therefore it should not be taught to our kids in schools. One side note there is actually critical race theory isn't taught in public schools. It's a term that has been taught in higher education for over 40 years. And it really is talking about the systemic nature of racism and the importance of us looking through a lens of systemic racism to understand how we might improve our society, how we might take a critical look at the laws and policies of our society that continue to disadvantage some at the advantage of others. So that's just an example of how. So let's just say, which it has happened in states that bill's passed. So now teachers are unable to teach truth about our history, which, and if they do, they could be written up and the public school could lose funding, federal funding. So that's what this is about. And let's think about the impact of our white and brown and Black children. They all suffer. That it continues to create and perpetuate an internalized dominance and an internalized oppression within our Black and white and brown children. And they go out into the world and they become lawyers and they become doctors and they become teachers and they become pastors. So that's one example of how a colorblind racism or colorblind mentality gets itself within a bill or a policy that impacts our current and our future generation. So that's all I've got for now. I feel like I could talk about that forever, but maybe that's a starting point that can help others dig deeper.